1939. On September 1st, troops of the Third Reich invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. It was the worst and longest war of the 20th century. In less than 2 years, the fascist plague had spread across most of Europe: Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Germany defeated its enemies with a series of lightning-fast campaigns. For over 2 years, Hitler's troops remained unbeaten. Another blitzkrieg was being planned. Hitler was expected to invade and conquer the Soviet Union. However, his blitzkrieg lasted 4 years and turned into what would be the collapse of the Third Reich. This is a fragment of pre-war film about oil production in Bashkiria. Its considerable oil reserves were such that the region could have been called the Second Baku. The Soviet Union increased its oil production and in 1938 ranked second in worldwide oil production. Hitler's Germany was not even in the top 10, yet 30 million tons of Soviet oil a year could not be compared to 500,000 tons of German oil. We invaded Russia because of oil, Albert Speer, the Reich's Minister of Military Industry, would later write in his memoirs. While at a clear advantage in oil production, the Soviet Union was far behind Germany in military fuel reserves in 1941. Hitler had accumulated 7 times greater fuel reserves for his blitzkrieg. In order to win the war of engines, the Soviet Union had to win the war for fuel. For all 5 years of the war, the Red Army was supplied with fuel continuously. Behind this cliched phrase were the incredible efforts of hundreds of thousands of oilmen, as we would now call them. But in those times, the oilmen were in reality 13-year-old teenagers, the elderly, and women, all of those who had replaced men who had gone to the front. Many oil-producing plants and oil refineries which worked during the Great Patriotic War continue operating today. 13 of them as part of Rosneft. These legendary refineries, such as Saratovsky, Syzrensky, Ufimsky, Topsinsky, and Komsomolsky, provided, as the newspaper Pravda wrote in 1941, the USSR's mechanized armies with their bread. Engine War. In the first months of the war, when the Soviet army was retreating from its western borders, there was sometimes not enough gasoline for 1.5-ton tow trucks. Soldiers had to carry ammunition by hand to the battlefields. They dragged multi-ton guns dozens of kilometers, since on June 22, Hitler destroyed almost a quarter of the Soviet military fuel depots with his first air attacks. The German invasion disrupted communications and transport connections. The railway was suffocating from a large number of trains with goods and cargoes headed to the front. Nevertheless, the country evacuated entire oil enterprises to the east in order not to lose them. The fuel shortage had to be eliminated. In 1942, Hitler was given a cake as a gift for his birthday. That cake was the Caspian Sea, Baku, and its oil rigs. He also received a swastika as a symbol of the march to the Caucasus, the oil breadbasket of this large country. The tactics of the lightning-fast war were to seize the Soviet oil fields, first and foremost in the Caucasus and Transcaucasus. This meant that the Soviet Union needed a second oil front. Therefore, specialists from Baku, Grozny, and Moscow were evacuated to Bashkiria, along with their entire enterprises. Ufa quickly became a second Baku. Bashkiria had planned to increase capabilities gradually, but now the Azeri fuel cut off from the front forced Bashkiria to grow its fuel supplies dramatically. This required a lot of local oil. Making every possible effort, the Ishimbaevsky field boosted its oil production. Women and teenagers replaced the oilmen who had gone to the front. The Ufa refinery operated 24 hours a day. The oil industry of the Great Patriotic War had a woman's face and an uncanny endurance. Women worked even as derrick hands at jack pumps, at great heights and with heavy pipes. Emma Go was 19 in 1942. She cleaned wells so the oil could come out of the ground unencumbered. It took more than 1 month to cure Bashkiria's oil industry of the fever caused by disruptions in equipment supplies, staff shortages, and the subsequent decline in production. Nevertheless, the concentration of oil union specialists in the second Baku paid off. At first, it was the Kinza-Bolotovsky field. A year later, another field was discovered in Bashkiria, unique at that time. Oil was found at an unprecedented depth of over 1,000 meters in the Devonian Sea. On the whole, 37 oil and gas fields were opened in the USSR during the war, 21 of them in the eastern regions, and thus the country's new raw materials base was created between the Volga and the Urals. During the Great Patriotic War, the Red Army used 13.5 million tons of fuel for the tanks going into battle, its dominance in the air and at sea, while during the 7-month-long Battle of Moscow, only 290,000 tons of fuel were used in 1943, 156,000 tons were used within the 1.5 months of the Battle of Kursk alone. Technically, it was in the rear. In reality, we were on the front line. Without the Saratov refinery, there would have been no fuel for the engines of Stalingrad and no victory in this crucial battle. Its importance made it a strategic objective for the German troops, Hitler demanding the factory be razed to the ground. September 20, 1942, an enemy air raid on the Saratov cracking plant number 416 began. The bombardment of the factory began at 1945. The raid involved 17 dive bombers. During the raid on factory facilities, the bombers dropped 15 high-explosive bombs weighing 100 to 200 kilograms. This was the first German air raid. For the next week, these raids continued every day after sunset. German newspapers wrote with delight about the success of the Luftwaffe in destroying an important target on the banks of the Volga. However, the plant was still supplying fuel and much more to the front line. Following the defeat of Stalingrad, Hitler's dreams of Transcaucasian oil collapsed. He could only count on the resulting disorganization of oil and fuel supplies in the Soviet rear. After all, with every year of the war, the Red Army increased the might of its armored fist. In the engine war, the Soviet Union was already fighting on equal terms. Therefore, in preparation for the summer offensive of 1943, Operation Citadel, the German command set itself the task of destroying the oil industry in the Volga region. This is what the factory site looked like after several days of bombing. In June 1943, 19 out of 46 reservoirs were completely destroyed. The power plant was destroyed. The tank car loading rack almost completely burned down. These photos were taken by German pilots from the 100th Viking Bomber Squadron. This was their report on the completion of their mission. In this diagram, the places and targets of bomb attacks are carefully plotted. Red dots signify high explosive bombs, dots with rays, bombs with self-igniting liquids, blue dots, bombs that did not explode, as well as marks indicating fires. It was not only the oil products that burned, but also the earth that was soaked with them. The German command informed Hitler of the complete destruction of the largest oil refinery on the Volga River. In fact, it was only 80% destroyed. But the oilmen did the impossible again. A month later, in July of 1943, the refinery once again began to exceed its plan. The bombing killed 4 times as many temporary factory workers than those refinery workers who were killed at the front. 800 people in total. They fought for their homeland. And this memory is carefully preserved by their children and grandchildren at Rosneft's Saratov oil refinery today. Each factory had its own front line. The Tuapse terminal shipped oil even when there was fighting outside the city. The work did not stop for 1 minute for all of the war's 5 years. Krasnodar Neftgaz did not even give a single drop of oil to the enemy. The last wells were preserved by the oilmen when the German troops were already on the outskirts of the city. Samaravneftgaz employees managed to discover 8 new fields despite the ground being frozen and the pump jacks covered by blizzards. They were dug out with the shovels by women and teenagers. Syzran oil refinery was assembled from the evacuated factories in Odessa and Kherson using 2 tractors. They built this factory in 1942, but now they don't recognize their own factory. Veterans are taken to the Rosneft's Syzran oil refinery. The bus is like a time machine. There is a completely different factory outside the windows. But it is all because of them, the veterans, that what they see around them now has become possible. By the start of the war, the future plant had only its newly laid foundation and several tanks installed. The refinery was planned for commissioning in 1944, and only if specialists and working men could be found, and if supplies could be allocated, rather than having to assemble the refinery from what could be salvaged. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was harsh in these places, and for Mikhail Kukushkin, these were the first ever working months, on a construction site just after completing the 6th grade. In the first 2 weeks of the war, 16,000 men left Syzran as volunteers, pensioners, specialists who were not allowed to go to the front line, and a labor army of teenagers and women remained on the home front. By January 1942, it was already clear that the plant would be completed. Yet, who would operate it? Out of 450 workers of all trades that were needed to launch it, only 180 were available. Half of them were women, as noted in the documents kept in the Rosneft Museum of the Syzran oil refinery. However, there was no indication anywhere that these were teenage girls. Syzran started supplying products to the front lines in the summer of 1942. The final Soviet army rush to Berlin received 150,000 tons of fuel. Fuel from Saratov, Syzran, Ufa, Komsomolsk, Orenburg, Dagestan, Chechnya, Tuapse, Samara, Krasnodar, and Sakhalin. This was a victory for the country's oilmen, a victory for them in the engine war. They did not rush to attack. They did not throw themselves at pillboxes. They did not capture informants. They worked on the home front. Yet it was everyone's patriotic war, each person having their own oil, metallurgical, coal, and its engineering fronts. These fronts and their front lines made the Soviet Union and its people the victors forever. The Second World War is one of the darkest pages of the 20th century. Fascism brought the power of evil down on top of our most important values: human dignity, love, and life. Countries worldwide clenched a powerful common fist together to crush this evil, one that was ruthlessly killing people, killing children. History teaches us not to forget its lessons. Our common strength is in the mutual respect for one another, in the ability to engage in dialogue and find compromises, encouraged to resist the pressure of the will of another, in our capacity to defend one's interests, taking into account the interests of other countries, so that the arrogance and aggression of one single power may never be possible again.